Hi, my name is Olivia Lake, and today I'm going to be talking briefly about my final research project titled What's Guiding GSAs, reviewing three popular Gay Straight Alliance resources and their recommendations for educators in North American high schools. Moving right along into my research problem and purpose, after completing my year one paper on both the positives and negatives of gay straight alliances in North American schools, I found that there was an enduring homophobia experienced by LGBTQ youth and queer identified youth in these schools, and that one of the most common strategies for combating this homophobia was to create gay straight alliances, or these student-led clubs that focus on social, safety, and activist-like activities surrounding the rights of LGBTQ youth. However, there was also limited access to written materials that were specifically created by school boards on the formation and sustaining GSAs. And then also that few scholars have actually identified and researched how the private resources that most of these clubs turn to based on the lack of board-based resources inform GSA practices. So they haven't looked at how do these written materials, in what ways do they impact the practices of GSAs in a school context. So based on these findings, the research question I chose to explore was, what recommendations do popular GSA resources commonly promote to educators? And in what ways do they encourage harmful strategies and ideas that might hinder the progress of these clubs? And then the subsequent question is to explore how the language in these specific GSA resources limits or encourages student agency, reinforces racism, addresses intersectionality, conceptualizes allyship, and further marginalized queerness. These were all issues that were identified by my literature review. In terms of the methodology for this project, I elected to do a document analysis by looking at three specific resources. And then in conducting this research, it was important to me that the sources I chose reflected the conditions of my literature review. Hence, I've identified specific inclusion criteria based on the location within a North American context, that these resources be freely accessible to the public, that they be directly specified for educators, and then that they be established, credible, and widely read resources. Given that so few scholars have looked into how these resources affect GSA practices, I wanted to be certain that the documents I were selecting were most likely read or at least referenced once by educators involved in GSAs. So the three documents I chose are listed here. They are mygsa.ca Equity Inclusive Education Resource Kit for Ontario Educators by ELO Canada, a GSA Advisor Handbook by the National Association of GSA Networks, and then Glenson's webpage virtual resources, which includes numerous resources on how to run GSAs. Something that affected my methodology in this research was also my positionality. I acknowledged at the onset that I'm a white, cisgender, and able-bodied individual. However, my lens at which I approach this subject is also as a queer femme woman. I do acknowledge that sometimes I have straight passing privilege. I'm a student in academia, which affords me, a certain level of privileges as well. And so consequently, in my literature review and throughout my paper, I try as best as possible to amplify the voices of marginalized community in my work by referencing, BIPOC queer individuals. So out of my coding of these three resources came 7 key findings, or what might be called categories. So these relate to advisors and student leaders, GSA formation, engagement with school community, community outreach, allyship, club demographics and intersectionality, club structure, activities, and initiatives. So within each of these findings, I explore what the resources have to say in terms of these titles, or in terms of these roles and responsibilities of the club. So I don't have time to go into every single one of these themes. However, I wanted to give an exemplar of what I had to say. So for advisors and student leaders, for example, I identified in these resources that given their frequent opposition and backlash that GSAs receive, many of the resources offered explicit praise for advisors in the form of thank you and appreciation posts. So quote, as an advisor to a gay-straight alliance, you may very well be the only supportive person to students at your school, writes Busby et al., which are the authors of Eagle Canada, adding, thank you for being that one person. And so this appreciation for advisors has implications for educators because it means that they are receiving praise in some ways for participating in this type of work. However, also within this category are notions of an emphasis on student leadership, reminders that this is a student-led club and that students should be doing a lot of the work and decision-making of this club. And so this raised questions for me and based on my literature review and problems that other scholars had raised about how this might make students the educators of their own oppression in some ways. So finally, implications and recommendations for educators. This is a more lengthy slide, just given that I couldn't explore all of the 7 categories in detail. But some of the recommendations that I made for educators based on these 3 resources and in combination with the literature review is that school boards should consider creating their own GSA guides or resources that are tailored to the specific needs of their student demographics. These resources are very vague and overarching in terms of their recommendations, but more acceptable and more useful would be if school boards were to create GSA guides that reflect the demographic of their student body. 2, that school boards should provide formal training to educators that wish to facilitate GSAs. While these booklets make recommendations for advisors, they in no way substitute a formal training on anti-oppressive politics. 4 is to continue to offer strategies and insights into managing backlash to GSAs using legal precedent, school policy, and relevant research. All 3 of the documents had sections which addressed and how an advisor and students might combat certain backlash that they receive, either religious or political or from school administration. And this was a very positive and empowering insight that came out of my research. 5 is to increase information and guidance they provide on intersectional frameworks in queer spaces. Few of the scholars provided extensive recommendations on how to address intersectionality, which has been documented as a problem in GSA spaces as they've been dominated by white youth. To review the language and parameters they use in communicating the roles of allies, there seemed to be a privileging of allyship in the resources, which is another common theme that was found in the literature, even using language such as, straight participants will be willing to help out, or even the suggestion that GSA clubs should be located in private areas of the school, which can further marginalize queerness. And then finally, 7, few scholars, as I was acknowledged, have conducted in-depth analysis on GSA resources. And while this current study builds on this literature, significantly more research is needed in this area to fully understand the effects they have on club operations. So that is all. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope that it gave you a little bit of insight about how I went about this process and some of the key findings.